Hey guys, it's Khalil,
Hey, it's Jed.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. All right, so to piggyback off of the last episode, we used examples of how nuclear deterrence can allow human rights abuses, and we used Ukraine right now with the war that's going on over there between Putin and Zelensky and their peoples, and how like a lot of civilians are dying as a result of Putin's aggressive action. Um, but I mentioned near the end how Xinjiang and the Uyghur people persecuted by the CCP um, are another example of this. And we might continue and use the example later on in this video, but because for certain key reasons that we might explain later on, it is not exactly an example of nuclear deterrence. Um, so um, so we'll shoulder that till later. Um, with examples of nuclear deterrence, though, and the crises that may come because of like miscommunication between powers on the um, before a nuclear war is about to go out is a great example of that, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. All right. So for about 2 weeks, the world was about to go to war, and it the reason for it I'm about to explain to you right now. So the events that led to um, the Cuban Missile Crisis are very long and convoluted, but the part of it that is most relevant to the example we're going to refer to it that was part of this crisis is the blockade that the United States put up around Cuba to stop Soviet shipments from entering the country. And so we had dozens of ships, you know, all different types of class naval cruisers, battleships, all surrounding the country. And so with that, you had Soviet submarines continuing to ship aid at the very bottom, you know, of the sea, you know, beyond, um, the um, the site of those warships of the U.S. that were blocking it from the Caribbean, from the entry to the Atlantic. Um, and that is where our crisis begins
Yeah,
with
yeah,
Soviet troops and with Soviet submarines trying to evade this blockade here that you see, you know, with the fighter planes, you know, like continuing reconnaissance missions to find and pick anything up, as well as on the surface with the deployed warships.
yeah. All right. So, like you said, one of the biggest crises that emerged already in an incredible tense time was the story of the Soviet submarine B-59. So this submarine, I think it was dispatched from Russia on a secret mission to escort Soviet shipments to Cuba. And this was during the blockade, and so of course Russia could not have any communications with this submarine, and it was not made known that submarines were escorting these ships because one, they weren't supposed to be shipping goods still to Cuba, and they did not want to know that they didn't want the U.S. and anyone to know that they were having submarines kind of shadow the ship. So when it set off for its voyage, they disabled communications, went undersea, typical spy stuff. And so when it was nearing the U.S. naval blockade, it was eventually detected. So some U.S. Helicopters, they have sonar, Doppler radar, all that kind of stuff. They detected the submarine on October 27th, so in the midst of this blockade. And when they detected the submarine, some of the warships around it started dropping depth charges around the vessel. And these depth charges, they weren't, so basically, bombs that they dropped down to try to destroy ships. These weren't full charge depth charges, they were training ones. The people on these ships, the story for them hasn't been exactly revealed, but it was likely done to kind of just harass them, mess with the Russians, typical American stuff. So while the US was dropping training depth charges on them, on the submarine, the situation was much different. So the crew of the B 59 had no communication with Russia. They had no idea what was going on. They couldn't know that this was a blockade, and in their perspective, they were being attacked. They thought that the US was dropping full bombs at them, you know, and for all they know, World War III could have started. On the surface, the warships could have been fighting the Russians. Nuclear war could have already happened. But for that submarine, since there's no communications or anything like that, they have no way to know that. So all they can do is guess. And when they're under attack, from what's in their perspective, depth charges and wanting to be sunk, they believed that they were under attack and that a war has started. So on this submarine, they were equipped with a single T5 nuclear torpedo. It's about 10 kilotons. It would be launched at usually like a capital ship, and yeah, that thing would be sunk. And so they had one of these. And given procedure on Soviet submarines, it requires all the commanding officers to give approval to launch this weapon. Given the significance of it. And on the B-59, the story is that there were two commanding officers, but they had another officer included with that, and that man's name was Vasily Arkhipov. So this man, he wasn't a commanding officer. I think he was related to it, commanding something else on the ship, but he was included in the argument, in the voting for whether or not to launch this torpedo. And so since most of the people on the submarine believed they were under attack, they were wanting to launch this torpedo at I can't recall which ship it would have been, but one of the ships in the blockade. And since it required that three vote, they had that vote, and two out of the three of the commanding officers on that ship decided to launch the torpedo. And the one who objected to it was Vasily Arkhipov, the guy I just mentioned. And so eventually, through different negotiations with just the other commanding officers on the ship, they decided not to launch the torpedo. Although they might have been at war, for all they knew, they didn't think that it was worth it, and they didn't think it was worth that kind of mistake to lead to something even bigger. And it was later in that sub's life, there were some issues with the submarine, with like batteries, air conditioning. I mean, these weren't high-tech submarines, so they eventually had to surface, and then they would learn as they, went back to Soviet territory that war didn't start. The blockade happened, but no shots were fired, and no war was happened. This story ended up coming out very recently. It was classified for years, and it came out in like the early 2000s. So this is a relatively new story that we knew, but this example shows how close that we could get to nuclear war when tensions are high, and there's no communications. Any sort of mistake or miscalculation or misjudgment can lead to Armageddon. If all those commanding officers on that submarine had decided that yes, they were under attack, yes, World War III had probably restarted, and it was in their best intentions to continue the war, they would have launched that torpedo, hit a U.S. ship. The U.S. would have called that as a Russian attack, and given that it was nuclear, not only would Cuba have been bombed, but likely the Soviet Union, and there you go, nuclear exchange, nuclear war, hundreds of millions dead. All of that over the inability of a submarine to communicate and some incorrectly interpreted signals. And so this, like as I said, the big takeaway here from this kind of circumstance shows how risky that having your finger on the nuclear trigger is when you're already in a crisis. When you're in a place that deterrence hasn't stopped a conflict to escalating to this point, it's really dangerous when when any sort of mistake could lead to the end of the world.
Right. So before you go on to use the other example of the 1983 false warning incident, I also want another reminder for the viewers here that this was not the only crisis that was occurring between American and Soviet leaders. Just in, I believe, 1961 and 62, there was also the Berlin crisis. And it'd be cool if we had a map here, but I don't think you guys need it. Basically, Berlin is part of the Soviet occupied zone. that it took over after the Nazis were defeated. Um, and Berlin was about 100, 150 miles within the Soviet zone, something like that, something like deep within the Soviet zone. And because Berlin was such a prize to the Allies at the time, um, they they carved up the city, between east and west, between like certain occupied zones. And so the British, French, and Americans, they all combined like their occupied section into West Berlin, as they did with their half of the country, so it was West Germany. But the Soviets, though, they had their part of East Germany and policed it very heavily. And so, of course, you might have heard about the wall coming up, and how like certain there was a brain drain because people under Soviet control wanted to go to the Western occupied areas, and so they would go to that side of Berlin. The Soviets were about to sign a treaty with the Eastern German government to recognize West Berlin as part of that country, as part of East Germany, because again, Berlin is part of that Eastern German occupied zone. Um, so this is where you have the crisis of Checkpoint Charlie, in where tanks on two different sides of the border of Berlin, of East Side and West Side, were faced, as short as 80 meters in some areas, um, and where they were about to start firing each other at tanks, and um, because of the tense situation, Kennedy, the president at the time in 61, 62, I'm not exactly which year, was about to deploy 148,000 troops, mostly American, to take back the city, to take back their section of the city. And so again, that's another example of miscommunication. You know, that was another example of how between the Soviets and the Americans, if you don't have communication between the two leaders, then a lot of bad things could happen. We can only imagine what would have happened at Checkpoint Charlie. People that know the full story know, and we can only give you a piece of that information because we want to try to make this episode as short as possible. But it was after that moment that there was a phone line established between Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviets at the time, and Kennedy, the American president. So that was really what diffused the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, was that phone line so that they could communicate with each other. And Chad's going to explain a little bit of that before we get on to the example between the crisis year of 1983.
Yeah, communication is key. Had there not been any nuclear weapons at stake during Checkpoint Charlie or Cuban Missile Crisis, it's pretty likely that a conventional war could have broken out. One, because conventional wars, it's a lot less deadly, and in crises like these, like I said, mistakes are prone to happen. Um, but the case of like the Cuban Missile Crisis and Checkpoint Charlie, where nuclear weapons were existing and were a threat, any mistake can lead to not just a conventional conflict, but to a nuclear exchange. And as we said, that's the end of the world. And so it's key that in these situations, in these crises, clarity is needed because, as I said, any mistake now has much more dire consequences than there would have been if it was just a conventional conflict at stake. Um, and so with that, I'm going to go on to another example, and where it's not the issue of a mistake per se, but an issue of an error, a technical glitch that itself could have caused another mishap that would have led to nuclear war in a much more direct way than some like Checkpoint Charlie or the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this event happened in 1983, and 1983 was a very, very, very contentious year between the United States and the Soviet Union. Some of the notable things that happened was that in April, the United States and allies in NATO held Fleet Exercise 83, which to date was the largest fleet exercise ever held in the North Pacific. It had about 40 ships of United States and I think Allied origin. And so during that, the Soviets, of course, were on edge, but the U.S. flew six F-14s over Soviet airspace over their island it was Zeleny Island in the Kuril Islands, with a simulated bombing run. This came out later, but the Russians noticed this. They didn't have time to respond, but they were arguably very, very spooked. And this led to, um, again, if there was a mishap, say the Russian scrambled fighters and they shot them down, then there you go, you have another conflict. But anyway, that was one of the events that happened in 1983 that increased tensions. Another was, which happened right before the incident which I'm going to describe, was the shooting down of Korean Airlines Flight 7, and this was in September 1st of 1983. The Korean Airlines flight flew. It was on a ways to, I believe, I can't exactly remember where it's going, but it had a navigation glitch in which the pilots did not know that they were crossing into Soviet territory. And coincidentally, a US spy plane was in the area at the same time, so when the Russians picked it up on radar, when they saw that plane going into Russian airspace, they thought it was that reconnaissance plane, or maybe even a bomber, going in for an attack run. So they scrambled fighters. When they set the jet up, the airliner didn't respond, and the Russian jet shot it down, thinking that it was a United States spy plane. Once again, this happened at night, so it was really hard to see, but some of those circumstances led to the Russians thinking it was a United States airliner. And so after the Russian cover-up was exposed and it was revealed that they did shoot it down, the United States and the world was arguably very, very mad at the Russians for this thing for happening. And so in 1983 was a very, very tense year. And also more things happened, like Reagan's speech of the evil empire, disinformation in the Western NATO, and then other just things that had the Russians spooked. So this is where we get into the incident that I'd like to describe. So on September 26th, 1983, a lieutenant colonel by the name of Stanislav Petrov was on duty in a bunker, in a nuclear command bunker around Moscow. And so he was on duty. It was a little after midnight, and he saw on the big screen that in Russian, like one of their early warning satellites, was detecting a U.S. launch of an ICBM heading towards Russia. So what was weird about this is that the satellite detected only one missile, and Stanislav and just some of the other officers themselves was pretty knowledgeable, of course, of nuclear planning. And so in a nuclear exchange, it's very likely that the United States would launch hundreds, if not thousands, if basically all of our nuclear arsenal, if this was to be some sort of first strike against the Russians. It wouldn't just be one missile. And so it was a little strange to Lieutenant Colonel Petrov when he saw this on the screen. And another thing that was in play was that the satellite that was picking this up, the Russians had a little idea that it wasn't the most reliable, given it was the 1980s. Early warning satellites were still pretty new, and Russian technology was not up to par, to the same standard as the United States. So at the end of the day, a couple minutes after, because there's not a lot of window time where this could have been reported, Stanislav decided not to call this in to HQ in Moscow, and he called it off as a technical glitch. And it was figured that he was right. The satellite that detected that first launch, it was a cloud. It was a reflection off of a cloud in the high altitude night that made it think it was a missile. That's that's how unreliable it was.
Bad
It's
one. Bad one.
a
I mean,
cloud.
that's the thing. Like, if I can just interject for a quick second, like,
Go ahead.
I think all of us can really understand the the consequences of that decision. If it was not taken, if he didn't want to take the chance and was like, I
Hmm.
don't want to get hooked, then
Call
uh,
that into the office. The
yeah, what
commanders
about
would
to
say
the
strike,
office?
and yeah,
Very war hungry superiors would feel obliged to respond, um, and we'd be in a nuclear exchange. Now that
and
would
we'd be
mean
dead.
exactly like neither one of us would be alive if this happened, because like at least one of our parents lived in a somewhat big city in the America, which would likely be attacked in case of a Soviet nuclear strike.
Oh
And
yeah.
so,
I'm
same as
pretty sure most of you viewers also would not have been alive through that either.
exactly like most of the human race would die as a result of this. But yeah, exactly. Like, it you tend to realize how personal a lot of this information can really get. Like with a lot of other things that happen in history, you don't really think about the fact that if something happened the other way, you would die too. And you're like, shit, I wasn't even alive then. But with this one, it's particularly interesting. It's something that a lot of you guys probably already know about, that you know things about, but you don't know the details. But yeah, it's crazy to believe that the two of us, who weren't born until like over 20 years afterwards, we could be dead before we were even born if this were to be taken the wrong way, if Lieutenant Colonel
Yeah,
Stanislav Petrov were to have gone and did another thing.
yeah. If a war was started over a glitch, like really,
So
you'd
it
be
really,
telling in the history books that the whole human race was wiped out because of a glitch.
well, there would be no history books because we'd all
Well,
be
you
wiped
know the
out.
one dude in the cave who wrote that stuff down. Probably
Yeah,
one of them.
yeah, it's got to
I
be
mean,
one.
it's gonna be like Fallout. There's gonna be some guys left.
Right. So if a glitch can cause the end of humanity, and literally one guy made the decision to not end all humanity, this man literally had all of humanity in his hands. Okay. And he saved us. Okay. So you can really just imagine just how razor thin not only the tensions were, but because of like something as simple as like
A cloud.
bad network connections, or like a cloud reflection, ending all humanity. That's a bad one. That's a real bad
Yeah,
one.
yeah. It's also funny to note that this happened twice, and it's both been Russians that have saved the world from nuclear annihilation.
It's
Both Arkhipov in 1962 and then Petrov in 83. It's already been Russians that saved us twice.
like the lone Russian guy, the low rank and file Russian guy that's just like, what, I'm feeling like not ending all humanity right now, you know, like maybe Stalin or Khrushchev or Andropov would have made completely different decisions, but it's like the low rank and file guys who really don't want to lose their family, that really want to stay alive, and just really hope on the other side being reasonable, and, just hoping like against hope that like that that the world really is as reasonable as they think it is, that the other side would not be so stupid as to nuke us. So yeah,
Yeah,
something interesting to keep in mind, what the average, low rank and file soldier can decide when he has the whole world in his hands.
yeah. So at the end of the day, it seemed like some reasonable people have saved the world. And I mean, as we start to wrap this one up, I do have another topic that I want to bring up of something that's not not as reasonable, and that is the idea nowadays that like politicians both in the U.S. and in Russia have been pushing to make nuclear weapons more usable and accessible. And this comes in the form of tactical nuclear weapons. So these are bombs or missiles or artillery shells or even backpacks. There's literally a concept for a backpack nuke. It's very interesting. But these are the ideas that nuclear weapons could be used on the battlefield to change the lines of combat or usually get the other side to back down. And so it's been very popular both on the Russian and the United States side to kind of buy into this and to make it so that nukes could be used more often. But the problem is that you're using a nuke. Like you're starting off yourself initiating a first strike, while not a strategic one, but a tactical one that's just going to incentivize the enemy to do another one. Say you bomb the enemy's airbase, you just expect them to just kind of take that. You're going to bomb one of your air bases, and then you're going to hit their command center, they're going to hit yours. Then you're going to bomb like a ship, and it's just, once again, nuclear war is an escalation, and it's just gonna go keep going up and up as soon as you use a nuke. And so it's very frustrating when you have nuclear weapons being peddled as something that needs to be used more and be implemented more when it comes to like our nuclear arsenal. One of them I want to point out is one that's pretty recent. Um, so in 2018, one thing that usually comes out in the United States in our budget request is what is it? The Nuclear Posture Review. So basically, it's a report that looks at all our nuclear weapons, our stance on the world, how well is deterrence working, all that kind of stuff. You know, pretty budgetary, strategic things. And one of the things that it requested in that Nuclear Posture Review was for one of our warheads that we use on our submarine launched ballistic missiles to be downgraded to a smaller yield so that it could, quote, help counter any mistaken perception of an exploitable gap in U.S. regional deterrence capabilities. So, what they would be doing is downgrading the yield of a strategic nuclear weapon, which had the warhead was about 90 kilotons, down to a 5 kiloton warhead. 5 kilotons, for reference, that's less than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those were 15, this one would be 5. And so, the idea behind that is so that if for some reason, tactically, they wanted to launch a ballistic missile at a site, it could be used in a precise manner and take out whatever target so that it's flexible. I mean, the whole idea behind this is somewhat absurd, both in the brief, like in the broad perspective and specifically. So in broad, as I said, any use of a nuke is just mean the enemy's going to nuke back. And if even if they don't, like if you're using that against like some terrorist or non-nuclear armed nation, it's just a bad look, especially when we have conventional weapons that can do the job. Specifically, this idea itself just doesn't make sense. You're putting a tactical weapon on a strategic platform. So you're going to be launching a submarine launched ballistic missile that could be parked outside of Russia's borders. And so when they see you launching a ballistic missile, how do they know that you're launching not a first strike against them or anything like that? You're launching a little tactical weapon to go blow up some terrorist group in Syria. How do you know they're not fooling you and going to go blow up Moscow? It doesn't make sense. And this even goes, they're still trying to do this with hypersonic glide vehicles and putting them on ballistic missiles, but just at their own, there's no way that the other side's going to know the difference between a nuclear armed strategic missile or a conventionally armed or like a tactical nuke. There's no way to tell the difference. It just doesn't make sense. And all it's doing is just making nukes usable, which should not be a thing. Nukes should not be used. That's the whole point of deterrence, is that you never want to use these weapons because of the capability that they have. Any use of them, or the preferred use of them, means the end of the planet. And so the whole reason that we have nuclear weapons is so that we don't use them against each other, and so therefore we don't get into a fight with each other. We don't have these wars. This is why we haven't had World War III. It's because if the US was to fight the Soviet Union, it's very likely we would have ended up nuking each other and ending the planet.
And even today, when Putin put the nuclear deterrence forces on alert on Russia's borders, even along NATO borders, um, the Allies didn't know how to respond. But they did say that even if Putin was thinking of using a limited nuclear bomb, or missile in Ukraine to take a city that they couldn't storm, like Kyiv, then like again, like with a smaller yield, 3 times smaller than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Which, I guess if you look at comparisons, it's a lot smaller than the other
It's
nukes that we
still a
have.
nuke.
It's still a nuke, and that is a really big point that Biden hoped to make clear to Putin, was that any nuke, even a chemical strike in Ukraine, would result in a full response.
That's a step too far. That's where deterrence comes in. You're supposed to stop from even getting to that level because of
Right.
what could come.
Because it's not just like the idea of how many people you could kill. Because like with a smaller yield like nuclear weapon like a 5 kiloton one, I suppose you may not kill nearly as much as you would with Tsar Bomba, but you would still, you would um you'd be you would be breaking a norm that had been
Hmm.
established in 1945 after the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. A certain like a how do you say it?
That's like a custom. Like nuclear
A,
weapons is not
yeah, but
just the bomb itself, it's an idea. And
we
that
have
idea is mutually assured destruction, deterrence.
we have 77 years of a streak that has been ran where we did not use a nuke against people, and what Biden, Johnson, Macron, Schultz said to Putin, mainly Biden though, was that if he dares to even use a small nuke in Ukraine, then we will send everything at you. And so far, we have not seen a nuke in Ukraine.
Yep. Yeah, the takeaway. The whole point of nukes is to not use them. That's why tactical nuclear weapons, in my opinion, don't make sense. And that's what happens when people think that they could just. When people see nuclear weapons as just a weapon, but it's so much more than that. It's, as I said, it's the idea behind it. It's mutually assured destruction. It's deterrence. When you use one, all of that's gone. I don't care if you use it against an empty island. I don't care if you use it against the enemy's biggest city ever. Once you use it, all those customs are gone. All those boundaries are off. And you're just on a track to basically end the world. So the whole point is to never even get there. And so that's where nuclear deterrence comes in. And as we kind of wrap this one up, that's one of the big takeaways that we want to have, not just in this video, but in this series. Is that nuclear deterrence, the whole idea is that we have these weapons so that we never use them. It's weird. You invest so much money in something that we'll never get to use in combat. I'm sure some military general is pretty angry about that. But that's the point. You don't use them because you don't want to end all life on Earth.
And you don't
That's
want to use your weapons at all. It
mm-hmm.
is defense spending too. I mean, of course, you want to be defended, but again, as Chad mentioned, nukes are the best force multiplier in any arsenal ever. That's why
Probably
the
in history ever too.
that's why the idea of Khrushchev using the idea, he didn't actually go through with it 100%, but the idea that you would only ever have nukes in your defense, had a fair amount of credit to it. Because why have an army, if you're already internally secure? Like you're only planning on using it for offensive operations, but if you have a nuke or thousands of nukes, then no one's ever going to want to attack you, and that's defense.
That's
So
deterrence. That's
yeah,
why so many countries get nukes, is that you don't want to spend so much on a military when you could just have a couple bombs that could stop the world's greatest power from invading you. So why even make the effort? That's what makes nukes so much different than just any other bomb. Like I said, it's not just a weapon, it's an idea, it's a concept, it's a theory, and it's basically a pact with the whole world that we'll never do this again because we have it. We'll never use these. And hopefully that's the case. I hope I never get to see a nuclear explosion in my lifetime, if not through a test in some historical context. I hope I never get to see one. If I do, something has failed. Our nation and our kind of world has failed if any of us get to see a new nuclear detonation used in anger against another country. We have failed if that's the case.
which is why the whole international community, each leader, while also showing restraint, they must be hard on the warning against any aggression towards themselves, to stop another side from using conventional forces against them or even nuclear forces against them, because you have nukes as your ultimate defense, not just for yourself but for the whole world. then you have to hold on to it really tight. You have to tell anyone that could potentially be a threat to you that they will be absolutely destroyed if they try to get anywhere close to you. You know, so if you see another world leader, I mean, if you see a world leader using like war rhetoric and like threatening the use of nuclear weapons against another world leader that is being incredibly aggressive, know that it may not just be saber rattling, it may actually be the defense of the entire human race.
Hmm. As I said in one of the previous ones, as I mean, there's a lot of existential crises that we're having to live through, such as climate change, economic collapse, all sort of political things. But nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence still exists, and it's honestly one of the most immediate threats that we have against ourselves, because it could happen at any moment. So take this issue seriously. When you hear nuclear weapons on the news, don't just kind of brush it off, because this is an issue that's not just going to affect some little country. It can affect everyone. Even a little localized nuclear conflict can screw over the whole planet. So this is not an issue you take lightly. If you hear your senator talking about wanting to win a nuclear war, don't let that slide. If you hear, as Khalil said, if you hear the world leader talking about nuclear weapons as a threat, don't take it lightly. They might be serious, and the consequences, as we've shown, are dire and are honestly tragic. So don't take this issue lightly. It's a very serious one, and it's very immediate. And that's kind of what we wanted to do with the series, is to show the issue, show why it's important, show what it is too, because not a lot of people know about nuclear deterrence. I mean, it's a pretty high up there concept. But as we've shown, it's one that can affect all of us. So I believe it's one that we all need to be paying attention to, and at least know a little about as we go forward into even more treacherous times.
Which is why we knew that this episode was going to go a little longer than 30 minutes. I'm actually surprised it didn't go on for any longer. So yeah, this series is really interesting. It was one that Chad in particular really wanted to post and get you guys' output about out there.
As you can
Um,
see, I'm very passionate about it.
yeah. Our next series is going to be almost as it's going to be more out there. You know, it's going to wrestle with the idea of fascism and about how a lot of leaders that took on fascism as an actual political system, like Mussolini and Hitler, may have actually used liberal or Marxist documents in the introduction of their political theory. So essentially, it is the thesis, although however uh,
Controversial.
however controversial, that fascism has liberal roots, or at least it.
Take some elements from it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes. We're just gonna leave you with that, and like we'll see how much of a good case that we can make. But yeah, until then, we are the Marshals of Truth. Bless the YouTube algorithm. Like, comment, subscribe, share it to people that you think might be interested, or even those you think that won't. And we'll see you in 3 days.
have a good one, everyone.